top 3 rules are: don't get lost, always look cool. When you get lost, look cool. And that doesn't mean leather jacket and sunglasses. That means look like you're not freaking out.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer, on Talks with Dr. Shafer. Thank you so much for being here. I'm a physician, mom, life coach, musician, author, and I am passionate about using storytelling as a tool to help you reclaim your story and build your most beautiful future. We love to have inspiring and informative guests on the show, and today is no exception. I am so excited to welcome R Monroe onto the show. TR is a writer, poet, former U.S. Marine, and state trooper, as well as the host of the show Hump Day Calls, where he shares interesting stories of creative people. I was fortunate enough to be a guest on HDC, or Hump Day Calls, which is how we originally connected. And in our pre and post show chats, as well as during the show, I realized that TR, you have such a compelling story to share about your experiences. And I really wanted to have you come on Talks with Dr. Shafer to share it with our listeners. I am so excited to hear about what you've learned and the stories you have to tell. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Compelling. I've not heard that as a description before, but okay. Very well. Compelling.
I really connected with our conversation and your experiences because I do think that there's somewhat of a barrier between the general population and people who have served in the armed forces and people who serve in protecting civilians every day as a state trooper like yourself or in other areas. And I would love through this conversation we have today to try to take down that barrier a bit so that we understand one another better and understand what it takes to do that important work and what training goes into getting to a point where you have the right mindset so that you are serving the best and most effective way and connecting with the people that you're serving.
Sounds good.
Tell me a little bit about what goes into training a member of the armed forces or a member of the police force so that you do know how to deal with things such as conflict, to work on de-escalating and being an effective communicator.
There's a lot of things that are similar between the military training and the civil service training, but then there's some things that conflict. And I remember one of the ones that kind of stuck out the most in my mind is in boot camp when I was at Parris Island, and we were doing pugil stick fights, which is you put like a football helmet on, a couple of pads, and then you have a double-ended, like a large Q-tip, except it's, you hit the other person with it. And you have different ways that you're supposed to simulate combat with a rifle. And we were doing that on maybe the second day of the Crucible, which is the last week of training in boot camp, where after that you become a Marine, you have your ceremony and everything after. But during the Crucible, it's maybe 2 or 3 days of you're up. Maybe you have 4 to 8 hours of sleep during that time. You do a lot of things that you would see on recruiting posters, crawling through the mud, shooting, things like that. And we were doing this pugil stick thing. And when I was in the middle of the circle of everybody and you're fighting this other person, I realized that police training, because I was a trooper before I was a Marine, the police training was more minimum amount of force necessary to effect the arrest. And the military training was whatever you do, it's going to end with you stomping on the person's face. And I can see the application for both of those and the need for them, but it is hard to switch back and forth from them. And I think that's one of the reasons when you see a military force go into a place like Iraq, for instance, and then in the 2003 version, that you have your force that goes in and does the war part, and then you take them out and you put other people in to do the policing part, because it's hard to switch back and forth from the war fighting idea to the policing idea.
That makes me really wonder and contemplate, and brings me back to conversations I've had with veterans about that transition from when you are on active duty and you are required to follow certain protocols and show up the way you're supposed to for your job, to keep yourself safe, keep your brothers and sisters in arms safe, and complete your mission. And then when you come home, what does life look like? Because like you said, a transition needs to happen. But how does that happen, and how long does it take? And what helps people get there if they're struggling?
I was in the Marine Reserves, and I went in 99. I joined the delayed entry, and I was a trooper starting in 98 is when I went to the academy in Virginia. So they had a program called the Reserve Split Program where you could go to boot camp 1 year and then you drill with your reserve unit that you get assigned to after boot camp for a year. And then that next year you go to whatever school you're supposed to have, the specialty you're having. And then you're back into the reserves just like that. But you can still work your civilian job while you're doing the Marine stuff. And it made doing push-ups easier in boot camp when you know you're on vacation from policing. So you're getting paid there, and then you're getting paid by the military while you're doing that. So that made it a little easy. But the whole switching back and forth, I think I noticed it the most in 2003 in July, coming back from the Middle East and being in Oceanside, California. We were deployed for about 6 months, and we had a month either side of that in Oceanside at Camp Pendleton when we were doing the workups and then the work downs. And when we got back, that first weekend of Liberty where you get to go to Oceanside to the movie theater or whatever, I had my backpack with just like a raincoat and things like that you would carry around because we didn't have a car or anything. We were E3s and E4s. And we go to Oceanside. And I remember waiting in line at the movie theater thinking, why am I waiting in line after serving the country? Why am I waiting in line? And then I thought, wow, that must be a huge deal for people that did more than me, which I was just over there ready to do what they asked us to do, but didn't really get the opportunity. We were in a surgical company, so most of our time was in Camp Coyote, just in support of the people that were doing the fighting. But I thought, wow, if I'm thinking that just off of my experience with it, what are people thinking that have done 2 or 3 tours or that are active duty and doing things like that all the time? So it is interesting to understand that there's not much training for going back and forth to that. I think maybe that month at the end of being deployed was to get everybody back in the States and look at them and just make sure they could still function in society. And I don't know. I don't know if that's the case or not. And I don't know how much training operators get that are active duty in the States and then they get deployed or they go do a mission and then they come back and they're home by the weekend. I don't know if they get any more training than a reserve person does or not. But there is some you go through those feelings when you come back. And I think realizing them is one thing. And when I got back to work with the state, then they had a program called the Critical Incident Peer Debriefing, CSIM, Critical Incident Stress Management Group. And I got to go to that training. And I don't think it was because I just got deployed, they sent me to it. I think it was just because I wasn't on the schedule, really worked back in, that it would work for me to go to that training. But that was some pretty great training, which talked about how to deal with stressful situations, and you facilitated conversations between other first responders that had gone through things, and you're facilitating a conversation that that's purported to be non-judgmental. And from all the stuff I saw, it was where you have everybody that's involved in the situation sitting in a circle and they're talking about it. And everybody gets to say their perspective, and it puts the pieces of the puzzle together for everybody. And I think that helps a whole lot in understanding what people go through and considering other people's perspectives.
Absolutely. That perspective taking is so important as a team, right? When you're on the same team, when you're the emergency responders from the various fields, but then also taking the perspectives of people that maybe aren't on your team, but they're a part of the environment. And I think that's one of the perspectives that is hard for people to appreciate sometimes if they haven't been involved in policing or being a first responder, what it's like to be on that other side and to be serving. What kind of training, you said, and you've told me before that that was a very impactful training experience that you had. What sorts of things, other than these circles to, basically decompress and really assess a situation after it has transpired to give all those perspectives, what other training were you exposed to that prepared you to have these difficult conversations and charged situations so that you can de-escalate, get the information you need, keep yourself safe, and work towards resolving these sorts of situations?
In the military and policing, there were both the obligatory classes on how to deal with stress and how to take control of the scene. I think that's the biggest training, is knowing what your job is and knowing what you can do. Certainly with policing, the biggest thing was, when can I arrest somebody and what can I arrest them for? And you didn't want to make a mistake. You didn't want to arrest someone you weren't supposed to, but you didn't want to let the bad guy get away either. So I think maybe without it being classified or put the name on it as this is to teach you how to deal with stress, it was knowing your job is what kept you less stressed. And then knowing that there's people around you doing the same thing, people that have done it before that you could talk to, and then talking to your peers about events and taking a lot of time of thinking about things before they happen. What would I do in this situation? What would I do if I was at the mall, at the food court, and somebody came in with a rifle and started shooting people? What am I going to do? As the police, I'm going to do something. I'm not going to run. Maybe I'll run and try to find some cover, but I'm not going to not take action. That was one of the great parts about policing, was there wasn't a question of whether you're going to act or not. You're going to act. So you've taken out those seconds of decision that maybe a normal person would see a situation and go, this isn't real. This isn't really happening. What's happening here? And you already know I'm going to take action. So I liked that training of it. And then the talking with other people was a way to do it too. A lot of military is the hurry up and wait. You're going to do this, but you're going to wait 8 hours before you do it. And one of the guys that, when I first started in the reserves, when I first got to the unit and we're sitting in this room, it wasn't, maybe the unit I was in Newport News. It was a surgical company. So there was a lot of Navy. There were corpsmen and doctors and maybe 8 Marines, 12 at the most. So you'd get there for your weekend drill, and if you didn't have anything planned where you're going out to the field, you're either inventorying the warehouse, which just means you're out of sight and counting things that are left over from Vietnam and World War II. But we're sitting around the conference room table, and another guy goes, look, drill is all about coming in here once a month, checking on your friends and seeing what's going on in their life. And he meant it as a joke. At least that's how I took it. But that's for real. That's what it is. You're going in to see how they are. And it's one of those, the whole time that you're in the reserves, you're ready to go. You're thinking about what you're going to do when you go. You're making those preparations of, how am I going to pay these bills and what do I need to do with all these other things? But you're also waiting. It's just, you're waiting to be called. So I think you spend a lot of time thinking, a lot of scenarios in your head. I think that's the way you deal with stress, is to, if there's something stressing you out and you think, well, what's going to happen when this happens? Well, think about what's going to happen when that happens. Have 2 or 3 scenarios in your mind, a couple of plans, so you have your fallback plan or whatever. And then the military rule that I like the most is always look cool. And I think it's the top 3 rules are: don't get lost, always look cool. When you get lost, look cool. And that doesn't mean leather jacket and sunglasses. That means look like you're not freaking out.
Exactly.
So I think that's a lot of it.
And I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that, because I giggled a little bit, and I figured, though, that what you mean is calm and collected, right? And that is such a superpower to have. And it sounds like what you're saying is that a way to get there is through preparation. I always say, don't be scared, be prepared. But I think there's also a fine line between anxiety, which is when we're kind of stuck in these future thoughts that are based on past experiences, and we're kind of projecting the past and our fears onto the future. And what you're discussing is something different, which is, no, I can have a list of things that could potentially be challenges that could go wrong, or could be opportunities for me to, need to use my skills. How am I going to address those? And just having a plan in place. So like you said, you can skip that 2-3 second pause that might be the difference between life and death, or something really challenging happening, and just dive into the plan because you've thought about it before.
And to have a plan that is adaptable enough to where, if there's something that you never thought about before, it's close enough to something that you have, so you can just switch right over to that. And you're going to do it quickly, and it's going to seem like you're not thinking about it, that you're reacting. But then that just means that you prepared enough. It's kind of like the Olympics. I can't remember which one it was, when the archer fired the flaming arrow into the Olympic torch to light it at the beginning of the ceremonies. And I think it was a French archer. And no doubt, coming out of the thing that's above the stands, the torch that was supposed to be lit, you could see the gas flowing. So you just had to get close to it, but you had to get close to it. And he shot the arrow, went through. It was beautiful. And they asked him after it, was he worried he was going to miss? And he said, I wasn't. I had practiced appropriately. That's good.
Yeah, that preparation piece. How do you think it has affected your mindset and just how you approach the world in your civilian life and just in your day in, day out, to have been in positions where you had to really consistently be on high alert and have that level of preparation? How do you think that's affected the way that you think and show up on an average day?
The hypervigilance, probably when you're active duty and you're somewhere doing military stuff, or you're policing. Like, I haven't policed since 2012. So it was an adjustment for about a year or so, where you're thinking, okay, I'm not going to do this thing that I thought I was going to do policing. Like, you're not going to be able to arrest a person. So you're a normal person now. You can't solve all the problems directly like that. You have to think of a different way. So then you go back to that. Well, what am I going to do? So you prepare that way. But for preparing for policing and the military, I think a lot of it is you have to step back from it and not think it's so personal. I think that was the easier part of policing, was if you went to a crash scene, you have been trained, and maybe at your first one, it's not as good as it is at your 300th one, but you know what you have to do. You know the end outcome of writing the report and getting the road open and all these different things, making sure people are okay. That's the first one. And I think you detach from it enough to where you can perform under all those kinds of stresses. And if it's something that you might normally not be able to take, if it's your family member, it's not your family member. So it's going to be different. If everyone was too emotional, then nothing would get done. Maybe. I don't know.
Is it hard? Like we talked about taking off one hat, switching modes of operation when you are on active duty or when you are serving as a part of the police force and you're doing these things during the day or during your night shift, and then you go home to your family or your roommates and just kind of normal level conflicts are coming up, normal bids for connection and control, right? Because human relationships are flawed and messy at times. Was that difficult to navigate when every day you could potentially be in these situations where you had to put that hat on, that, the enforcer hat on, and then go and be with your family?
Maybe because of the law enforcement stuff, you just switch to a higher level of hypervigilance all the time. And that's just where you are all the time. And certainly if you get into a situation where somebody's pointing a gun at you, it goes up from there. But then you're trying to avoid the tunnel vision. But maybe that's off track a little. So coming home from work policing, if the people you're coming home to know what you've been doing, then that's okay. Usually they'll give you space. It's just like anything else. If you have a family member that comes home, you can tell if they're happy, sad, whatever. And then with the military, I think it's a little different. When I was in from 99 to 2007, we didn't have as much email and certainly not video calls, and people didn't have cell phones and stuff all on them when you're in the field, especially when you're deployed. But I think that might make it easier to deal with because you're pulled out of that day-to-day civilian life and you're dealing with what's in front of you right here. That doesn't mean you don't think about it, but you try not to think about it. I would think that you'd drive yourself a little crazy with that. So I'm not sure how people deal with it now, where you could just either you're videoing things on a battlefield or you can use a phone on the battlefield or wherever. That seems like a big distraction. But that you're in that time and place when you're deployed, which is different than coming home every night if you're policing.
It's really interesting because something that we talk about a lot on the show is focus, and really try to help listeners take stock of things like how many times they're, for example, getting distracted and shifting gears throughout the day, because you basically only have so many shifts in you. And when you bring this up about, wow, this is an interesting new challenge with modern technology, that if you have your cell phone and you're deployed, yes, how wonderful that you can, chat with your kids or your spouse or your family, but how difficult and potentially distracting it could also be. And that's a perspective that I wouldn't have necessarily considered before you brought this up, that, you're shifting those mindsets, and that's going to use up energy and focus. And one of the mindsets you have to be in for survival and to do your job is one of, like you said, hypervigilance. And that can be really tough to just shift back and forth.
I remember getting a chance to call back home in Kuwait. I think we went from a Camp Coyote that didn't have phones to a place that did, like an army base or something. Maybe it was Spearhead or Schwaba or something like that, the Port of Kuwait. And even when I could call back home, it's you call and you don't know what time it is really, because you're not setting, you don't have that time zones in your head so much. And especially back then. And then what do you say? I mean, it's just a lot of it is just, I guess it's nice to be able to check in and say, I'm still alive. You're still alive. That's great. See you whenever I see you again. And I don't think I would take that away from people in the military now to be able to talk to their family whenever they want, whenever they could, whenever it was allowed, that if they wanted to, that's okay. But I remember after the deployment of getting back, and so that was July of 2003, and just being much more grateful for the US and for the life I had here. And a lot of things that maybe would have bothered me before didn't bother me at all. Like I wasn't worried about it. Like small things at work or any other time, it didn't matter. And that feeling was probably 6 months or a year before. I don't know if it wore off or it was just I got used to the feeling. But I think I heard it on Joe Rogan's podcast, and I think he cited someone else that said the worst thing you've ever been through is the worst thing you've ever been through. So if there's people out there that haven't been through tough times, then when they're confronted with something that is tough, they're not going to handle it as well, or have the chance of not handling it as well. That's their biggest tough thing. I remember when I was a kid, this must have been kindergarten. It had to be kindergarten or first grade because I was going to school, but I was getting my clothes together for school and I couldn't find my belt, which was a cool Sesame Street belt. And I was stressed out because of that, because I couldn't find my belt. And I remember, I don't know why that sticks in my mind, but maybe up until that point, that was the toughest thing I've been through, is I'm stressed about getting ready for school and I don't have my belt. And then I was like, well, from now on, I need to have that ready the night before so I don't go through this again. And even now, I remember that. So I don't know why, but you can definitely mark those hard things in your time, in your life, and go, oh, okay, well, this is nothing compared to that. And then a lot of those, you can also look at what other people have gone through. And if you haven't gone through it, but you imagine it, you go, well, that really sucks. That's difficult. Maybe I will try to see it from their perspective and cut them some slack, or try to do something that maybe supports them. I don't know. But I think even in your own life, if you've been through hard things, tough things, and then you come to another thing happens to you that is beyond all of the difficult things you've gone through, you're better capable of dealing with it because you have been through other tough things. It's not, you're not worried about the belt. I like the way Jocko talks about it and says, Jocko, not that I know him personally, but Jocko Willnick, that those 2s and 3s on the Richter scale, don't let other people see those things. And I think we talked about before stuffing your emotions. We might have talked about that after we recorded that other podcast, but he has this thing where he talks about that with stifle your emotions. And I think that's good advice in a lot of ways. There are times where you need to show emotion, but there's times where showing emotion is going to cause a problem. So don't do that. Wait until you get to the point when you can. And I think that just goes into the self-control of things. Maybe that's, as people, we're scared because we realize we have very little control of life and we want to have more control than we're capable of.
That's really interesting. I think absolutely that's a big part of kind of cracking the mindset code, is getting down to sometimes our hypervigilance with small things and big emotional responses too small. Like you said, kind of it's a Richter 2. It's a 2 or 3 on the scale. We've talked about the stuffing and the stifling before, and I feel there's a distinct difference between getting to the point where you release control, and instead of getting upset about the small thing, you acknowledge it. Because I think once you acknowledge what bothers you and let it go, release it, because it doesn't have to change your weather, it doesn't have to affect your day. That's so empowering. And I think when I think of what you're saying about kind of hiding your emotions about the little things, what the work I've done for myself with regulating my own nervous system is just not even letting the small things cross those boundaries so that they even cause that adrenaline surge. So they even cause that change in your heart rate, right? They don't even change your weather. They don't change your nervous system response because you've learned the difference between me and you, which I think really makes me think about the incredible training you have to undergo to be a part of the armed forces and to serve in the military, on the police force, because to keep your cool, your calm, like you said before, in challenging situations, whether they be really challenging or even just mildly bothersome, a lot of it is that self-regulation. And I think rather than stuffing or stifling, it's more of a being really firm in your boundaries of that is you, right? That behavior is yours. I don't have to engage in it. It's not mine. I'm going to stand firm in who I am and how I want to respond to this.
It is one of my favorite things you've ever said, which is I've done a lot of work on my nervous system. How do you what do you do in order to be able to not let those things raise your heart rate or any of that? What work
Yeah.
have you done on your nervous system to do that?
So a lot of it was, I would say the biggest breakthrough for me. At first, I actually would trick my nervous system because I was going through something really challenging in my life, that was really triggering and quite frequently. And to get through that traumatic experience, I actually was tricking my nervous system. So when my nervous system was going into fight or flight, I would laugh, on purpose. And that would trick my nervous system because that was when I was in a really just very dysregulated, right? Things were just almost untenable. And coping was really challenging. So I actually learned to just trick my nervous system, and that would stop me going into fight or flight. And once I learned how to stop it, and again, these kind of level 9, 10 situations, not the twos, not the threes, but the really challenging things. Once I learned to just kind of stop the flooding so that I could actually take stock of what was going on and really work on the boundaries. Like I said, this is me, this is you. It was a lot of really understanding those boundaries and really enforcing them, because I think we can think we're doing that, but if we're getting triggered a lot, that's our trigger detector telling us, nope, nope, you have not really differentiated yourself from someone else because you are allowing their behavior to change your weather. You're allowed to have thoughts and feelings and responses to their behavior. But why are you giving up your autonomy and your own regulation to someone else, especially if their intent towards you is not good? It's not in alignment with your goals. Why are you doing that? And that comes back to not being upset with them or angry or changing them, but recognizing in those situations, as much as maybe they're trying to control you through their behavior, you may be engaging in counter control and ending up in what I call that tornado of that back and forth of control and coercion. And once you learn to really distinguish your boundaries from this other individual or this system, this thing that's really triggering you, now all of a sudden you can remain within your own weather. Your nervous system is not responding to something external, and you can decide how you want to respond in a centered way. So for me, that was not a quick process. It took a lot of mindset training and a lot of, when I would become triggered, just really thinking about it, not stuffing it, not overreacting, so to speak, but just really asking curious questions about why is this? Why is this so triggering for me? Because the thing that triggered you at first might be, something that actually was a threat to you. When you're out in the police force and someone pulls out a gun, that is a real, genuine threat to you. And you're going to have a response to that. And you hopefully can work through that response and make decisions that keep you safe. But that can leave a mark on you. And through post traumatic stress disorder, you may experience those same symptoms when you hear a loud sound or when you see a shadow. And you've got to learn to work through that through things like EMDR and other methodologies that you can use to take back control of your nervous system. But it really takes you being intentional about it.
So then the old adage of you got to laugh to keep from crying has a little truth to it.
For me, in those SOS situations, I found it to be effective. I don't know that it will work for everyone, but that was really in the height of really trying to get a handle on PTSD for me. That was an effective tool. What do you find when you were in those situations and you'd have to come home and you were feeling triggered? What were your tricks that you would do to try to stay centered when, I know level 2, level 3, you didn't want to respond to them. What about a 6 or a 7 or an 8? How did you cope with that?
Most of my issues in life have probably been, or most of my agitation in life has probably been with authority. So I don't like it when people are in a position to do the right thing and then they don't. Now, when you're policing and you're out there dealing with just the regular public, you're going to see people at their worst and at their best. I would expect it. But when you're dealing with an administration of policing or other police, you expect to see the best of people all the time. Now, I can cut people some slack for having a bad day, but I think that in the military too is you want to be around the people that are the best all the time, or as best as they can be, and trying to get better. So, as I said, most of my frustration was with administration, and I didn't expect it when I started. So that was disappointing. So I think first you got to get past the feeling of disappointment or hurt or whatever you want to call it, just the disillusionment of it, because I expected to deal with criminal elements in society, and that's okay. That's what you're there for. But, I mean, I guess you could say there are events where you go to a wreck or a shooting and you see somebody that wasn't involved in it, a kid or something that gets shot, an animal gets hurt. That's that type of thing to deal with. And then the other is the people that are supposed to enforce rules or follow rules or make rules or whatever, that they're not just and fair. One of the things that sticks out in policing is I had a captain one time, I was talking to him about something, and he said, well, life's not fair. And you hear that a lot. And I agree, life is not fair in a lot of ways. But as police, shouldn't we be the ones that are trying to be as fair as possible all the time? So I didn't have much patience or like for people that had the attitude in positions of power and authority that just think life's not fair is the answer to a question of why is there something wrong that's allowed to still happen. But as far as how to deal with those things, if that's what the question was, I think it's you talk to other people that go through it, and then you find a little bit of strength in knowing that people have been through it before and they agree that it's messed up. And then you talk to people that haven't been through it before, but you explain the situation from your perspective and they say, yeah, that's messed up. So you get a little bit of validation. So it's not like you have to say, is it me? Which I think is something we talked about in our conversation before of there's a lot of things in life that I'll try to step back from and say, is it me? If there's time to do it, step back and go, am I the one that's being unreasonable? And if that's the case, then you have to realize it and stop being unreasonable. But there's not a whole lot of things now that I see in my normal everyday life that aggravate me. And I don't know if that's just because I've dealt with enough aggravating things to be able to categorize them as this doesn't matter to me, or I can put it in this section and deal with it later. like kind of what we talked about before, not on here, but as far as you take those situations and you either stuff them in a sack and think about them later because you can't deal with them right now, or you look at them and then you put them on a shelf and say, that's what that is. It has the label on it. You understand it. You understand why you feel the way you do, and then you continue on with life.
And hearing you discuss this and hearing your story about the belt and your passion for justice, and wanting to protect that and the empathy you have for people. When you reflect back on your childhood and your young adulthood, what drew you to joining the reserves and joining the police force?
The reserves, I remember when I thought I want to be a Marine. And that was probably, 7 or 8 years old, walking through the woods with my brother and his friend. And I don't know why it occurred to me then. I think having a sword was part of it. Like, I wanted to have a sword, and maybe I saw a Marine commercial with a sword. And then another was when my brother's friend and him ran away from me in the woods. And I was like, hey, where are you going? Then my brother stayed. And I was like, man, that's pretty good. I want to be able to do that for people too. But I don't know if I really put all that together in the moment. I think it was just the feeling of it. Like, it was there. And then you can reflect on it later, from being scared of being left alone to then somebody staying with you. That probably was formative for it in my family growing up. Really lucky with the mom and dad and the brothers I had. So I think just having good examples in life, and we grew up going to church, I think that probably, I know that had something to do with it. You have to have a moral base for something to be able to know the difference between right or wrong. So I'm thankful for that. I do have a greater understanding, or maybe not understanding, but a different perspective of going and getting deployed and being in the Middle East and seeing people in the desert and thinking, this wasn't my biblical view of shepherds in the field watching their sheep at night. This is somebody that's in, it's not a nice place to live. So I can understand that they may feel differently about things than I do. But as far as fostering that sense of right and wrong and justice, it had to have happened when I was younger. And then, so there's the Marine thing, is around 7 or 8. And then when I was in high school, I was going to join when I was 17, and my mom wouldn't sign the papers. And then I was going to join again when I was 19, but it didn't work out right for work. And then I was in the process of going to the academy for the police in Virginia. And then after I got that, I was like, well, I just won't be in the military. I guess I'm just doing this police thing. And then I found out about the reserve split program. So then when I was 23 is when I went to boot camp, which is a little older, but there were still people there that were much older than me. But I'm glad I got the base programming of policing before I got the Marine base programming. Not saying either one is right or wrong. I'm just glad for me it worked out that way. Like, I do like the idea of a minimum amount of force necessary, but I'm also appreciative for the mindset of defend your country, even with your own life, even if you're taking other people's. So.
Wow. How does that feel as a young person? And now looking back, because I think as we age, our appreciation of life, my personal experience is that it changes, and when you have children yourself, when I had children, I was already a physician. I was already very appreciative of life, and I was very active in helping support life and save lives. But when I had children, that really changed my understanding of the value of life. I already thought I knew it 100%, but then I knew it 4,000%.
Wow.
Because it's just, you think you know everything, but then you have children and then you realize how little you know, and it's like the whole solar system is in their eyes. It's just, for me, it was such a formative experience. And I remember going back to work. I'd only been out for 5 weeks with my first child. And I went back and I was on call the first few days I came back to work, which means staying overnight at the hospital. I was serving 3 hospitals. One was a pediatric hospital, one was an adults hospital for underserved population, and the other was the veterans hospital. And I was serving all 3 on call that evening, and they're very busy inner city setting, so quite a busy call. And I'm nursing, so I'm pumping and not sleeping and worried about my baby and all of these things. And as I was going back and forth between the pediatric hospital, taking care of little babies, that are having medical emergencies, they could be having seizures, strokes, infections, things like that. And then going to care for, other mothers, other women who are, my age. And having gone through what I had just gone through with having my first child and being home and then coming back into the work setting and then serving again the population that I served as a physician, it was such an informative and just incredible part of my personal development. And I'm sorry, I've gotten us off into the weeds, but it just, what you were sharing really brought me into that, and how there are these moments in our lives where we think we understand the value of human life, right? We think we know it all. And then you learn something through connection with others or through experiences you have in your life that just, it's like they break a wall, and all of a sudden you see even more than you realized was there before.
Wow. It's another piece of the puzzle, parenthood. It's a piece that
Yeah.
I don't have, but I think the older I get, the more I see that I missed out on a piece of life, but I don't regret it. But I understand that that's might be one of the biggest reasons that we live is, make other humans. So it's it's good to hear that it puts those pieces together. I mean, I've had dogs that I really loved, and I can only imagine how much more that would be if that was a human. So, and I really love those dogs. So I can't imagine. I think that was one of the reasons probably for not having kids is the chance never lined up right. And then the idea of maybe with getting deployed and maybe in policing, I thought, do I want to have a kid and then risk getting killed and not being there for them? What's going to happen to them? And then with being deployed and seeing war, I think at that time I had the mindset of, I don't want the world to have that power over me. Of these are people's kids out here fighting, and I wouldn't want my kid out here fighting. And I think I feel differently about that now, but back then, and maybe there was a block of time for 10 to 15 years where that was the predominant reason for not having kids. And then it just seems like the chance went by. Again, I don't regret it now, but I understand that it's a piece of life that I don't have that piece of the puzzle. I'm glad there are people out there making other humans, though.
It's an important part. And that is certainly not to say that, having children is a requisite, because, there are actually plenty of studies out there that talk about happiness. And, if you're single or if you're married and if you have kids, it's different for different individuals. And we know that it's not necessarily the key to happiness, but I think there's such value in sharing the experiences that for each individual kind of broke that wall for them, and just help them to see the world in a different way. And for me, that was certainly one of the really transformative experiences. But another set of circumstances for me that did that was when I was in really stressful situations with colleagues where, not only are we serving patients, but our lives were on the line because unfortunately, even when you're just working as a doctor, I've encountered several situations where there was threat of life or there was assault and those things were happening. And we know that doctors and nurses lose their lives because of incidents in their offices and in hospitals. So unfortunately, even in medicine, there are those risks in our daily lives, and often we're not well prepared. And contemplating on that as you're sharing your stories, I think what an incredible connection you have to other people when you consistently show up for these people in these very emotional, scary moments of their lives. And you are showing up, as you mentioned, prepared, calm, with a plan, and can help navigate them. If they're in a situation where they don't know how to navigate, you're showing up to help them. You're like your brother in the woods. They're scared and they're feeling alone. And you say, "You're not alone. I'm here. We're going to get through this. We're going to figure this out." And I think that is a beautiful and impactful way to spend your time.
Yeah. Number one, anybody can be killed at any moment. I mean, you could die at any second of life. So I think I remember maybe, let's see, almost 50 now, probably in my late 20s. For maybe 3 days, I thought I was concerned about dying before I got to do some things. Like I was like, well, I don't want to die. Maybe that's that joint of time and life between feeling indestructible and then moving on with accepting that you're dying. But I remember it was a short time, and then after thinking about it for a few days, I was like, well, this is ridiculous. I've already resigned myself to dying policing. And then when I was in the military, I thought I'll probably get killed in the military. Like when you get deployed, I was prepared to not come back for that. So, and then in policing, I thought too, I'm probably not going to retire from policing because I'll be killed somehow, a car wreck, most likely. And I had a few times in life where I had resigned myself to dying right then, where there was nothing else you could do and it's just, this is it. And it didn't happen. So I was like, oh, okay, well, life goes on then. It doesn't help to stress all the times that you could die because you could die at any moment. I don't know if that's the right way to think of things, but I think it's an understanding of how vulnerable you are, but then you still have to live. So make yourself as hard as possible to kill, but understand that it could happen at any moment. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a healthy way to think, or is there a problem with that?
I mean, I wouldn't describe it as a problem. We all have our way of coping, and I think many of us have faced near death experiences where we thought, okay, this is it, and you either go into fight or flight, freeze, fawn, right? You have a multitude of ways to respond to it, and you cope in the best way you can, and that's going to evolve, as you've mentioned, over time. Your perspective on things change and your responses change. So I don't think there's anything right or wrong. I think just taking that time to, like you asked me the question, to ask yourself the question. I think that's the more important question, is what do you think about the way you find yourself coping with the stressors?
I will accept that as the answer. Yeah. It's not like I think about it all the time. It's not on my refrigerator, you could die at any moment. I don't think about that, but I think it does free up your mind for the space to think, well, what am I going to do to live today?
Yeah.
And maybe that's not something you wake up in the morning and say, what am I going to do to live today? It's just, everybody's making that decision all the time. Number one, to not off themselves. And number two, that you accept that you are vulnerable to the world. And three, what are you going to do while you're here?
Yeah, staying focused on the present and not getting lost in anxiety. And if you're feeling yourself being pulled in that direction, trying to bring it back into your body, into the fact that I'm breathing, right? I'm here, I'm in my house, I'm safe. I'm in my car, I'm safe, right? Getting back into this moment where you are safe. And then once you're better regulated, doing the deep diving into asking the important questions about, are these coping mechanisms helpful? Are they getting me where I want to be? Or is there a pattern where I see actually my coping mechanisms are harmful to me? And what do I want to do about that? So that's the wonderful thing about life is we're constantly able to edit and pivot and reframe and live in a better way than we did yesterday. Because today, like you said, you wake up every day, it's a new day. You decide how you get to live it. I want to dive into your big pivot and ask, how long has writing been a part of your life and what made you want to lean into that post life working on the police force?
I always thought I always wanted to be a writer when I was a kid. And I don't know if I ever thought I wanted to be police. I did have the thought of being in the military, but I didn't think that was the end of it. And I guess writing I had been doing since I could write. So kindergarten onward. And then serious writing in school, you learn a lot of writing, and then college, and then with work. I mean, the state police has plenty of paperwork. So I got to do writing. It might not have been the type of writing I wanted to do, but I do like a good report. So I think that I would count as my nonfiction writing. And then in 2012, about halfway through 2012, my wife got an opportunity to transfer from Virginia out to Washington in the Pacific Northwest for her job. And I didn't think, I thought I might do policing for 20 years, but this was a little over 14 years in. And it was a great opportunity for her. And she had stuck around when I got deployed. So I thought, yeah, that would be all right. That I could probably do policing out there if I wanted to, or we could do other things. And she said, well, if you move, then you can write and just focus on writing and taking care of the dogs. I was like, okay, well, we'll do that. So in 2012 is when I started writing the first book. And then 2014 is when it was published, self-published. And then it was, setting time aside every day to write in order to feel like a writer. Like, can you say you're a writer if you didn't write in a day? That's the big difference, is writers write. So I started writing then, and then have a few books out, did some co-writing with some other people, and then poetry books, maybe 2018, 2019 timeframe, started putting those together. And that took, I thought I would just do one book and be done with poetry and then go back to science fiction. And turns out there was some more poems in there. So then the idea of understanding better creativity, where it comes from, why does poetry seem so much different to me than writing a novel, and then exploring that. And then that kind of turned into going to writing groups and talking to other people about writing. And then with the lockdown, the writing groups got canceled. And I thought, well, how can I talk to writers? And that's when I started thinking about doing the podcast. And then it took a while to actually start doing the podcast. And then that's how that's gone. Maybe almost a year of podcasting, talking to different people about creativity, writers, poets, songwriters, musicians, painters. Creativity is so ingrained in everything we do. I mean, I think that's a thing about humanity that you can't separate from it, is that drive for creativity. So it covers a big topic.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I have definitely pivoted and lean into creativity. My life started as a songwriter and a singer, performer, and I've really dove back into being creative and have found that so fulfilling as a part of my story. And I love all of the work you're doing and yours. You made me think of an interesting guest you had on your podcast recently, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on it because it kind of puts the mirror up to what is creativity and how much do we value, how much do we need creativity as a species, as a culture. And you had an interesting guest, I can't remember his name, who was talking about AI and all of these ways that it's affecting creatives, the movie industry, how we promote things, etc. And it was really interesting because as a listener and as a creative person who does this for a living, I was listening to talking about things like illustrations, right? And how you can do this quickly, and how for some people it's great to them because it takes away work that would otherwise be kind of drudgery for them. But it was interesting for me as a creative person, yourself as a creative person too, because the thumbnails, the illustrations, how you format your book, those are actually a really important part of the creative process. And some of the best novels of our time and magazines, movies, in part, they were so impactful because of how they were edited, because of the lighting they chose, because of the way that they set up the background, because art is really impactful and connecting and meaningful. So when you, as a writer, are writing, you've committed yourself to this career and you're podcasting to share the stories of other creative people. And here we are in an AI run world all of a sudden. And what are the fears or concerns or thoughts you have about how that's going to change the landscape for people like yourself?
I've talked to a few people about AI, and I think the Gen Z diplomat was one of them. He has a podcast. I can't remember his name right now. Andrew Pearson was the show that was just on last week that talked about AI and mainly in gaming, like casinos. I think that was
Yeah.
him. And some other people talked to about using AI to create different things. But I think it's a big part of creativity because maybe it's just an extension of humanity. Like AI to me is just like another person, that it's a person that is going to have a wider knowledge than you, like database wise, because it's just everybody, it's all of humanity into one. But maybe it doesn't sort it like you do as a human. So one of my big questions is AI going to have that connection to creativity if it's otherworldly that a human would have? And I don't see why it wouldn't. I mean, you could get into an argument about soul and all that, but I think that creativity of whatever made everything that we know of is going to recognize creativity in something else. Like, if your kid has a kid, would you not talk to them? No, you would definitely talk to them. I mean, I think that's what, if our creator is out there and we are in a line of creation, and then we bring about this AI thing, that of course our creator would be interested in what AI is doing. But maybe that's off the subject a little.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting to hear your perspective. So what I'm hearing is you're almost seeing it as like almost an offspring of the human race, and now we're responsible for it. So instead of being threatened by it, we should feel responsible for it. It's almost what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think Joe Rogan again talks about it, and he quoted it another podcast I listened to recently, where he said it wasn't his idea, it was someone else's, but I can't remember who he said, that we're the caterpillar and AI is the butterfly, that we're creating this thing that we're turning into, because either we're going to be absorbed by AI, or it's going to like be a part of us and us a part of it, or it's going to destroy us. I don't know which way it'll go. But yeah, I do see it as it's the creation of people. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Well, we will see how it unfolds, and maybe someday, a year from now or down the line, we'll have another discussion and we'll look back and we'll say, huh, that's interesting how that unfolded.
Yeah. If we're still here, that'll be good.
Like you said, every day, right? No, but we're grateful for every day. And I'm so grateful for having the opportunity to have this interesting discussion with you. You've had such a interesting life. I do find the stories so incredibly compelling and connecting. And I really think that our listeners will have enjoyed hearing your perspective on the training and the life and the mindset that you've had as someone who's worked as a U.S. Marine in the reserves as well as on the police force. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you for your time, and thanks for your questions.
It's been wonderful. And please, TR, tell our listeners how they can find your books and learn more about you and find the podcast.
Amazon has all the books, and it's just, you can search R Monroe and it'll be on there. And for the podcast right now, it's Spotify and YouTube with links on Instagram, or Instagram and X, and YouTube also has clips, but for now it's just on the Spotify and YouTube. Just look up Hump Day Calls and you'll see it on there. Released every Wednesday.
Excellent. Well, it's a really interesting podcast, and I'll be on there soon in an episode. That was really interesting to have that discussion with you. And again, I'm just so grateful that you were able to join us on Talks with Dr. Shafer and share your story here. This has been really inspirational.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you to our storytellers for being here. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the show so you don't miss amazing conversations like I just had with R Monroe. Check out his podcast and his books. And I look forward to seeing you next time on Talks with Dr. Shafer. Stay safe and take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Everybody's lonely, but you can hold on to